Dear students, a very warm welcome to this edition of EPG Pathshala. We will be discussing here today the course on social policy. Our module that we will be discussing today is Social Policy, Key Concepts. My name is Sohini Sengupta. I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, and I will be discussing with you this module on this very important course, Social Policy. So stay with me and let's embark on the journey. The objective of this module is essentially to enable you to understand key concepts in social policy. We will also provide you with some definitions of these concepts. We will introduce you to the broader goals in social policy, and we will be discussing in brief some methods that are used for meeting social needs in the context of social policy. Let's start at the beginning. What do we mean by social policy, or what is social policy? Social policy may be defined as the action that is usually taken by governments or private sector, informal organizations, members of the community or family members to ensure that all members of the society are able to attain a basic minimum need, so that they're able to attain a basic standard of living and that they have access to opportunities with which they can improve their lives. Essentially, it's about ensuring that a certain standard of well-being is maintained in a society. Social policy also means the organization of welfare activities which are required to meet the needs of individuals and groups. It also means the ability and the methods to recognize the various social problems and needs that members of a group or individuals in a society may have, and the different ways in which we can solve these problems. In modern societies, social policy in general has come to mean the various actions and programs and strategies that the government undertakes, basically provisions of public goods and services provided by the state for the well-being of all. While these definitions sounds really simple, social policy in general can evoke quite a lot of public sentiment for and against certain types of provisions. Are these really doing good for the society? Should we have different types of policies? Shall we try new policies? Should we learn from other countries? And all of these things are associated with the amount of money that governments or individuals or even families have to spend on meeting people's needs. Let's look at what social policy is supposed to do before we get into the nitty-gritties of whether social policy works or whether it actually leads to improvement of people's social conditions or creates well-being for people. Social policy is essentially underpinned by progressive redistributive concerns. Why redistributive? Because it's based on the understanding that resources and means in a society are never equal. They're never equal for everybody. Some people have more and some people have less. In a natural condition of existence, it's probably okay for some people to have more and some people to have less, and there could arise various justifications for such an unequal distribution of resources or rights or liabilities or opportunities, whatever you may have. However, social policy begins with the understanding is that somewhere we should be looking for a society where people should be more or less equal in terms of the kind of living standards that they have. Therefore, social policy aims to increase the overall well-being of all people. This is to ensure that those who are disadvantaged in a society are not left behind or not lack in opportunities or in living standards as compared to the people, those who have better opportunities. It also problematizes and increases the visibility of deprivations, because unless we learn how to recognize deprivation, we would never take action to do anything about them. It provides remedial actions for identified social problems. Since it is very difficult to identify all possible problems that all individuals may have in a society and which is ultimately leading to their not having a great standard of living, social policy often selects and targets specific types of social problems so that it can create and design measures to deal with these problems. One of the broader goals of social policy, actually, which is beyond immediate social problems or needs that individuals or groups may have in a society, is to contribute to social stability by reducing deprivation. Too many deprived people, a society that is full of inequalities and wants, is not a great idea if you want to have a cohesive and a stable society which endures over a long period of time. The last goal of social policy, which is again related to the goal that we discussed before, is to reduce societal conflicts that may emerge from unprecedented extent of inequalities and which may lead some groups to feel grave injustice. So social policy has both immediate and broader goals. Let me come to the first point that we are going to discuss in this particular module. That is the brief background of social policy. Where did social policy emerge from? Where was it born? We are not going to try a search of origins, which is a very difficult exercise. Let's look at the 19th century. Social policy is usually attributed with the emergence of modern states, with growth in capitalism and industrialization all over the world. During industrialization, large number of people moved from their agricultural livelihood to cities and urban centers all over the world, but predominantly in the 19th century in the countries of Western Europe and in some parts of North America. As people moved from the rural backgrounds to the urban areas, they encountered newer types of risks and insecurities in their livelihoods. This is not to say that agricultural lives and rural lives were practically without insecurities. They did have insecurities, but cities and urban environments and industrial jobs created newer forms of risks that people were encountering for the first time. Simultaneously with these new types of risks, what also were emerging were markets in goods and commodities and services. Many types of commodities were available in these emerging markets in the new capitalized, highly capitalistic, modern and industrialized world where you could buy various goods and services. But many people who worked in these urban factories did not probably have incomes or stability of incomes to afford some of these services. Markets, however, were also prone to failure, which means that all the people who came from rural areas to urban areas with the promise of jobs and employment and steady salaries and improvement that the world around them promised did not actually become attainable for many of them. And in such situations, modern state took upon themselves the responsibility to come and help people to tide over the different contingencies that may face in life. So in one moment you have a job and the next moment you don't have a job. You may fall sick, you may have accidents at your workplace. Your children may want to go to school, you want to educate them. There are good schools, but you don't have the money to pay for a fee. And the government felt that if the markets could not provide people who worked in industries with sufficient security of livelihood and income, then it is the responsibility of the government to help them to tide over temporary crisis and insecurities. Social policy was born to address new types of insecurities in the modern world. This image essentially is from one of the landmark policy reports that was written by William Beveridge in 1942. Was a British economist. William Beveridge was a British economist who was attributed with the emergence of the welfare state institutions and policies in Britain following World War II. The image that you see in the previous slide describes 5 giant wants as Beveridge described them. Incidentally, Beveridge was born in India. He was the son of British civil servants in colonial India. When he went back to the United Kingdom early in the 20th century, he became an economist and an advisor to the British government. And he thought that there were 5 giant wants. And the first one was want, the second one ignorance, the third He thought was disease, the fourth squalor, and the fifth was idleness. And he felt that welfare policies were required, welfare institutions were required to deal with all of them. But the main thing was to deal with the first one, which was the biggest and the most horrible giant of all, and that was want. Want that we know, perhaps we better understand it with the term poverty or deprivation. Today, as we stand on the second decade of 21st century, want has not escaped us, it's still pretty much with us. And some of the lessons from the early social policy makers remains relevant to some parts of the world, like India even today. Let's move on then from the brief background, the emergence of social policy in the early 20th and the late 19th century happenings in the world, to more general things like models. Models are not necessarily reflections of what you will find out there. You may not find them in different government social policies or specific social programs, but they help us to both design the content of social policy and also to analyze the kind of social policies that different governments may be pursuing. We will look at some specific models of social policy now. Let's start with what is called the residual welfare model. As the name suggests, residual means that the government takes care of only some needs that individuals may experience. Yeah? And these needs are usually those that the government determines that the family, the community, the market, or any other entity is unable to fulfill. And it's only then that these other systems of social provisioning fail that the government steps in and provides welfare. And that is usually called a residual model of welfare. The institutional redistributive model, however, takes a far more expansive role for the state. It argues that the government has a responsibility to provide universal services to citizens, no matter whether they were also being provided by family, community, etc. It just has to assume that a certain basic level of services need to be provided to all in order that they never fall into certain types of contingency in lives and can continuously better themselves and the standard of living of their own and family members. Social expenditure. Now, social expenditure is really important because once you have designed a model, once you've designed policies based on some model, whether it's residual or whether it's redistributive, where does the money come from? Governments can have very noble ideas. Citizens may want their governments to do many things for them, but without the financial resources, it's impossible to do any kind of social policy. The concept of social expenditure is sometimes used to understand how much social policy any government or a state has. Social expenditure is the product of social policy made by governments based on the understanding that certain welfare needs must be met. Usually it is calculated as a proportion of a country's gross national product or its income. In India, social sector expenditure, for example, is defined as the total of all expenditure on two categories, social services and rural development, as per the central budget and the state budgets. There have been some changes in this as per the 14th Finance Commission. We will talk about it in the module on financial policy later on during the course. For now, social services includes areas like education, health, family welfare, water supply and sanitation. Rural development is the category which consists of anti-poverty programs. Usually to find out how much social policy or how much social work we are doing in our country, all we need to do sometimes is to see how much social expenditure we have. What is the objective of social expenditure? Objective of social expenditure can also be categorized into two parts depending on what kind of country we are. Most countries are classified globally in terms of whether they're high-income countries, middle-income countries, or low-income countries. As you may be aware, India has recently been classified as a middle-income country. In high-income country, the goal of social expenditure has been to support people in adverse circumstances. If you're sick, if you're ill, if you've had accidents, if you've lost your job, you want your children to go to school, etc. It's a form of social investment. It's considered to be a social investment that the government does for nurturing future citizens, because you want your citizens to be healthy, to be well nourished, to be strong, to be capable of pursuing their full potential. In middle income countries like India, as the name suggests, usually, and remember we are talking about expenditure here, we don't have that much money to spend on social policy, not always. And sometimes we may be doing very careful balancing between what is the most prioritized sector. Hence, social expenditure is usually targeted towards providing basic minimum needs, poverty eradication, and ending discrimination through affirmative action, in the sense that you target your expenditure to your priority areas, but not necessarily provide universal public services to all citizens. Let us look at some of the principles based on which social policies are designed. These principles are higher order philosophical thoughts which are needed to sort of persuade us why we need social policy, because as you've seen, social policy has a historical origin. People might argue that, it works for the West. It doesn't necessarily work for us or for our country. People might argue we don't have so much money. Why waste it on doing social policy? Why not spend more on economic growth? So there are certain principles which can argue for us why we need social policy. One of the first principles is the principle of redistribution. Deliberate intervention by the state to achieve welfare objectives such as creating greater equality along income or access to key services such as education, healthcare. It is driven by ethical and moral considerations of what is a fair and just society. If you do not have a moral and ethical notion about fairness and justice, it's unlikely that you will be persuaded by a goal of redistribution. The second principle is equality. Equality is the recognition that inequalities of income, class, race, ethnicity, gender, etc. can create a great deal of social disadvantage for particular individuals and groups. So no matter how well endowed you are or how meritorious you are, no one will ever get to know about it, because you will always fall behind in comparison to your peers or other citizens. Equality, therefore, is a key principle in social policy, because you do social policy to create more equality. But equality principle is often merged in debates about equality of what. And when we do a future module on redistribution and justice, you will learn more about this whole debate about equality of what. When we want to make equality, on what grounds do we judge that something or someone or some resources are equal or not? The third principle is the principle of rights. Are individuals' claims for social benefits and services and the fact that they want their governments to pay for some of their basic needs, is it legitimate? Is it legitimate? Why is it legitimate? It cannot just be because you need it. It cannot just be because you prefer to. But these become legitimate if they're backed by the force of law and are regarded as social rights. Rights, therefore, along with redistribution and equality, is a key principle underpinning social policy. One of the concepts that does not have the moral force of either equality, redistribution, justice, fairness, or rights is social needs. One of the key concepts, and remember we are talking about social needs and not just simply needs or basic needs. One of the key concepts underlying social policy, social needs, since for the provision of welfare services, we must begin with a recognition of needs and the organization of the society to meet these needs. Recognition of needs is much more complex than what it sounds, because on one hand, we all know what we need. When we don't have food, we do feel hungry. When you don't have water, we feel thirsty. But what about something as abstract as healthcare? We might be sick, but we might need to work, so we go on working, and we may not seek healthcare. So do we know whether we need healthcare? So need, therefore, is complex. Therefore, recognition of need becomes a complex exercise in the context of social policy. Bradshaw classified social needs into 4 different types, which is useful for us to sort of differentiate between how do you discover which types of needs are relevant for social policy. Normative needs. Normative needs are usually identified by experts. Why? What kind of needs are normative needs? Normative needs are when you decide that a certain society or individuals in a certain society may require certain kinds of resources or certain kinds of abilities. They need to be healthy. They need to grow up to a certain height. The children under the age of 5 need to weigh a certain amount of kilograms. We decide on all that. So experts decide what is good for society and therefore define needs, and hence these become normative needs. So no matter what individuals want, what they know or what they like, what they dislike, these needs remain. Felt needs are needs that we are personally aware of. We are aware of these kinds of needs. We know if we are hungry, we are feeling hot, we are uncomfortable, we are angry. These are all different kinds of self-aware needs. Self-awareness of needs is an important criteria in social policy making, but we will discuss why it can also be problematic. What are expressed needs? Expressed needs are when people who are aware about the kind of needs that they have convert this into action, which means that they feel something, but they want the states to do something about it. That is a conversion of needs into action. Comparative needs are needs that evolve out of comparison. Say, for example, you live in a community in a rural area where everybody is equally poor. Everyone lives in homes made of mud and their roofs are made of thatch. People are happy and contented and they lead a good life. Then some people go to cities, earn a lot of money, start building 2-story concrete houses. They have a satellite dish on top and they have television, and you start comparing yourself with your neighbors, and all of a sudden you're not that happy anymore. You feel that you need better jobs, you need better incomes. If you can't do it yourself, you can educate your children, and all of a sudden you have an expansion, an explosion of needs, and this is called a comparative need. Usually in social policy making, a combination of understanding of all of these needs are necessary to devise the right kind of social policy. Let's look at now at a new concept, the concept of welfare state. What is a welfare state? We have an entire module on welfare state theory, so I will not get into details about it. I will only introduce the concept of a welfare state. It is a concept of government in which the state plays a key role in protecting and promoting the economic and social well-being of citizens. You may ask, how is it different from any government? Because all governments are actually geared towards creating social and economic well-being of citizens. However, welfare states are very strong on social policies. They invest a lot of money in social policies. They use principles of equality, redistribution, rights, as we have discussed before. Here, welfare states imply that there is public responsibility for people who are unable to obtain the minimum provision of good life, and usually this public responsibility is guaranteed by law and factors in the budgets. So welfare states have very strong social policies, and they play a key role in promoting people's economic and social well-being through the instruments of social policy. What does a welfare state actually do? One of the principal activities, or the principal roles of the welfare state, is to modify the effects of market. If you remember, we mentioned the emergence of social policy at a tumultuous time when the world was industrializing and we were all getting ready to live in cities. In an ideal typical welfare state, the play of market forces is modified in 3 directions by a welfare state. The welfare state guarantees a minimum income irrespective of the market value of people's work or property, which essentially means that tomorrow if you're jobless or the market decides the skills that you have are of no value to anybody, you should not starve. You should not have to withdraw your children from school. The state will provide you with a minimum income. It narrows insecurity for citizens by enabling them to meet social contingency, which would otherwise lead to crisis. What kind of crisis? You could get indebted, you could sell your house, you could sell yourself, you could land up in all sorts of problems. You could get into bonded labor. These are the kind of contingencies that the government doesn't want you to do. The government wants you to lead a stable life, irrespective of whether the market values your work or not. It ensures that all citizens have access to the best standards of certain agreed upon social services, which basically means that if a society decides that everyone needs to have a certain level of education, certain level of health, certain level of nutrition, then the government will guarantee that irrespective of whether you can hold your job in the market or whether the economy is creating jobs or not, these kinds of needs will never be compromised. And that is how a welfare state's main role is to modify the effects of market. Let us look at a more recent term. While welfare state and social policy are terms that have been with us for 100 years now, social protection is a relatively new concept. Social protection is a policy strategy that emerged from the effects of global recession, which led to millions of people becoming poorer all over the world. And this has happened in recent times. As we are all aware, capitalism goes into cycles of boom and bust. For a few decades, countries are doing very well, people are earning a lot of money and everybody's having a good time. And then comes a time when global capital flows elsewhere. Suddenly industries shut down, people don't have jobs, and there is recession. Social protection is a concept that emerged in the mid to late 20th century to address the newer effects of global recession. It refers to the prevention, management, and overcoming of situations that adversely affect people's well-being. It does not necessarily center the role of a government or the state in creating these preventive and promotive and managing of distressful situations for people. But it does recognize a need for there to be protective mechanisms. Traditional function of social protection has been to enable individuals to maintain their living standards when affected by shocks or crisis. In developing countries, however, social protection has emerged as a key instrument for tackling chronic poverty and vulnerability, which means certain people have been poor all their lives and they're likely to be so for generations. And how does social protection enable them to overcome this kind of an abysmal standard of living? The role of the state is increasingly controversial in the designing and provisioning of social policy, because many social protection proponents probably argue that as long as welfare needs are being met, why do we need the state? It can be provided by anybody. It's a general perception, however, that the state is a dominant institution that is responsible for provision of welfare services. And in the coming modules, we will discuss why state has such a central role. Welfare services, however, may also be funded through and provided by a variety of different actors, such as commercial sector, public, not-for-profit, as well as informal sectors. This is sometimes described as the mixed economy of welfare. Conclusion. So with this, we come to an end of this module on key definitions and concepts, introduction to social policy. What have we learned here? We have learned about the meaning and definition and broader goals of social policy. You've also been introduced to key concepts and principles in social policy, such as redistribution, equality, rights, social needs, welfare state, and social protection. You will learn about all these concepts in greater detail in the forthcoming modules. For now, I hope this is a sufficient introduction. I would encourage you to read some of the readings that have been listed as part of this course module. There are also a variety of internet resources freely available to look at. One of the places where you can go to look at some of the social policy ideas and definitions is United Nations poverty reduction websites, the UNDP website, the World Bank website, the Government of India's Ministry of Rural Development website, the Government of India's Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment website. And thank you very much for your time, and I hope you found the module interesting.